on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
What is the fourth wall? It's in theater, it's this idea that, oh, well, there are definitely three walls, but there's an invisible fourth wall between the characters slash actors and the audience. And whenever the characters or actors acknowledge the audience, that is breaking the fourth wall. And this idea can be extended to literature where, the narrator or a character acknowledges the reader. Certainly in film, the Deadpool series is a great modern example of that, where the characters on screen are acknowledging the audience. I would argue that Mel Brooks does it just about as good as anybody else. But it's actually a highly contentious, controversial, much debated point among narratologists, this idea of debating the fourth wall. And what they don't use that term so much as they use the term metalepsis. Right. And that's where we refer to like fourth wall breaks as being meta. That's where it refers. That's what it refers to. And there are various types of this. I cannot bore you with all of them because there are books upon books of essay collections of breaking the fourth wall. That can be the narrator talking to the characters. That's a metalepsis. Characters talking to the audience. Even things like crossovers could be considered metalepsis, right? Where you have a character from Golden Girls appearing on some other series. But within that, I perceive something that has been talked about a lot in studiers of the phenomenon, which is this idea that when you look at the paranormal looks back at you. In my life, I've found that true to varying degrees. It's come and gone, but I think that there is something to the idea that once you start looking for this stuff, it starts looking back at you. And that idea of like turning and facing the audience and acknowledging that the reality you're embedded in is not what it seems, and that there are forces beyond the stage that are involved, observing, or perhaps even orchestrating, seems to me like the perfect metaphor for the paranormal. And it's really completely changed the way that I view the phenomenon.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I welcome back author and paranormal researcher Joshua Cutchin to discuss his latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, Reflections on the Paranormal, Narrative, and Fiction Becoming Fact. Joshua delves into the concept of metalepsis, where fictional characters seem to step into reality. The conversation also touches on philosophical questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the interconnectedness of different paranormal experiences. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. Joshua Cutchin has appeared on hundreds of paranormal programs, including Coast to Coast AM, and is regularly invited to speak at paranormal conferences about his work. He has written several books, including A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, and Ecology of Souls, Volumes 1 and 2, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. He is co-author with Timothy Renner of Where the Footprints End, Volumes 1, Folklore, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, and Where the Footprints End, Volume 2, Evidence, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. In addition to his own books, Joshua regularly contributes to essay collections, most recently Dr. Jack Hunter's Deep Weird and Dr. Simon Young's The Connington Fairies. He has appeared on the hit History Channel television series Ancient Aliens and was featured in 2024's breakout UFO documentary Cosmosis. He is a regular guest on Where Did the Road Go podcast and maintains an online presence at joshuacutchin.com. He joins me today to discuss his latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, Reflections on the Paranormal, Narrative, and Fiction Becoming Fact. Joshua, welcome back to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I am very much looking forward to this. I told you I finished reading your latest book, Fourth Wall Phantoms, yesterday, and I told you I had a complaint, and here's my complaint.
Okay.
And this is just my process. I always make it a point to read my guest books. I know not every podcaster does that.
Thank you. We all appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, it takes a lot of time, and that's, whenever at the end of my episodes where I'm like, help support my work, I do put in a lot of effort because reading takes time. But my complaint is this: my process is I never really have a list of questions for my guest. Instead, what I do is I will type out things that I've highlighted or underlined and refer to those. And
Typically, I have like 2, maybe up to 4 pages. I have 8 pages, Josh. 8 pages.
Yeah, this reminds me of something my friend Steve Berg said. He said he was going around with a highlighter, and we concluded that he didn't need a highlighter, he needed a redactor, so he could
Oh.
take out the stuff that he didn't want to pay attention to because he wound
Yeah.
up with basically the whole book highlighted. So thank you, or no, I'm sorry, some sort of words of comfort right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. I read it on Kindle, and so with Kindle, it's easy. I don't actually have to type everything out. The typing helps because it sort of reinforces it in my
Right.
head. But with Kindle, I can just copy and paste into a document. But, I mean, the book is fairly substantial.
It's too long. That's too long. Let's just say it.
Well, I actually wouldn't say it's too long because I didn't find anything that was repetitive or unnecessary. You're diving into some very deep waters here, and I love the approach. And I imagine that a lot of people, when they hear the title, Fourth Wall Fictions, we've heard the term fourth wall before. But in your subtitle, I think that is where it gets kind of closer to the heart of things, that paranormal narrative and fiction becoming fact.
Right.
And I can think of an immediate example of something like that. But I thought that, I don't want to babble on here about this. So I thought I would let you kind of address this and maybe in the way of kind of introducing the topic, and we can dive deeper, is to talk about the title itself. What does that mean? Fourth Wall Phantoms.
Yeah, well, I think too another aspect of the subtitle is that it's reflections on those
Mm,
three topics: paranormal
right.
narrative and fictions becoming fact. Because like this is, this past May was the 10th anniversary of a Trojan Feast. So I've been in
Mm.
this game for a decade, and it's kind of like a tilt your head and squint kind of memoir in some
Mm.
regards too. Just sort of the lessons that I've learned on through this process. But at a more pragmatic level, Fourth Wall Phantoms is a way of introducing a concept that takes me to some of those places that I want to really go in discussion
Yeah.
of this. The basic conceit of it is that I've been kind of fascinated by these stories that I just don't know what to do with because they're kind of too weird. And whenever I
Mhm.
see something that's too weird, I'm like, okay, you got to go there, Josh. Like you got to figure out some way to reconcile this with your view of the phenomenon. And the accounts in question are those where fictional characters step into reality from comic books, from film, from sort of personal mythologies too. There are tons of these stories. I thought that there weren't a lot, but there actually not only are there a lot of them, but they also come from some people that we, at least in the West, although an argument can be made for worldwide, hold in high regard as these lauded authors and creative types that say that, at the very least, they'll have interactions with their characters on the mental level, but progressively some people experience characters speaking to them audibly or actually seeing their characters or having visits from their characters. Very famous example of this, kind of the poster child for fourth wall phantoms, is John Constantine, the occult detective from
Mm.
Vertigo Comics that Alan Moore created. And there's this famous anecdote of Alan Moore being in a sandwich shop in Westminster, I believe. And he says that this bloke walks in and, looks just like John Constantine. They share a knowing look and he leaves. And other people who have worked on the Constantine title have also reported running into John. And every time it's kind of the same thing. Like they look and he knows that they know and they know that he knows, and then they keep going on their separate ways, which, given Constantine's attitude is probably for the best. But, tons of these stories. Gibson, who did the radio drama of The Shadow in those novels, there was a specter that haunted his old apartment that people saw that closely resembled the proto superhero of The Shadow. And even people all the way through Heinrich Ibsen, when he was writing Doll's House, said that he had an interaction with Nora, and actually was able to describe her dress. And if memory serves, she touched him, So I've been hearing these stories and like, what does that say about all this stuff about reality and all these different things? But more interestingly to like, the areas that I'm interested in, what if we extrapolate that? If these stories are true, which you kind of have to presume on some level if you're going to write a book about it, right? If these stories are true, what do they say about ufology and cryptozoology and parapsychology? A little bit of that ground has been covered in ufology before. Folks like Bertrand Mayust and even Vallée to a degree have talked about, how our cultures and our fiction seem to be reflected in the phenomenon. But putting those in dialogue with cryptozoology has never happened before, I don't think, because cryptozoologists hate that, right? And really putting it in dialogue with parapsychology, I thought was important too. Now, on the, at first blush, a lot of people might see the topic of fourth wall phantoms and go, oh, it's a book about tulpas and egregores
Mm,
and thought forms. And that plays a role, and that does get
mm,
addressed. But I think that the reality of it is so much stranger than we can really apprehend. And I think it's really important in an age when we have overused the term ontological shock. The disclosure folks are always talking about ontological shock. Like, let's face it, extraterrestrials are not ontological shock. Like, there's a place for that in our imagination, and there's a place for that in
mm,
our culture. Like, that slots in really easy. The true ontological shock is that UFOs might be so dadgum weird that they literally bend fiction and reality in their wake
mm.
and can cause, sorry, yeah, well, they bend reality and time in their wake and can cause fictions to step off the page or down from the screen to interact with us. So all that and so much more is fourth wall phantom.
Yeah. Yeah, the first thing I thought of, and you actually referenced it, which I was happy to see, but it was and I could never get the title quite right, but Jorge Luis Borges's short story, Tlan Ukbar and Orbis Tertius, where it's these people insisting that there were these ancient civilizations and that there was a encyclopedia reference to it, but it was all fiction. But eventually it turns out that it becomes real.
Right.
And it seems like that corresponds to a lot of what you're saying is that we have the stories, and that's really, I think, central to what you're arguing here, that we have these stories and that we keep telling the stories, and the stories somehow then become not fiction, they become reality.
Right. And what's interesting about that Borges story is that, Valet put that sort of in dialogue with the Umo affair that happened in Spain in the 1960s, I believe. And it was basically these supposed bits of correspondence from this planet, these beings from this other planet, and the documents were apparently very sophisticated, but it was all probably a hoax perpetrated by three-letter agencies to undermine, the Franco regime. But at the same time, like you get people who like were sort of independent from that, who were reporting seeing similar craft in the sky with that Umo emblem and stuff. So that's something that sort of is a disconcerting thread that runs underneath all this. Is like, are we the last people to understand this power?
Yeah.
Are there authority structures that have been using this to sort of shape reality for decades? Who's to say? I mean, if you'd ask the occultists, they'd probably be like, "Yeah, no, duh." Like, of course, that's something that's been happening. Like,
Yeah.
that's what we do all the time. But yeah, and this naturally invites into the discussion. It throws a wrench into the works. Is this manifestation or is it precognition in a lot of these
Mm,
stories? Like,
mm,
the famous example of the novel that Futility, the novel that predated the Titanic, described
mm.
a ship that went down under similar circumstances with a lot of shocking details. Was that, was the sinking of the Titanic manifested by the novel, or was the novel sort of like an intuition or a retrocausality, as Eric Wargo would put it? And I think it's a little bit of both. It depends sort of how to take it on a case by case basis. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Eric Wargo, I spoke to him very early on in the podcast, and he's one of the people that you rely on quite a bit here
Yeah.
and kind of engage with, and also Jeffrey Kripal.
Mhm.
And, I also wanted to point out at one point you mentioned Tom Waits and that you would have given your left arm.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and I'm a huge Tom Waits fan too, but I also feel the same about Jeffrey Kripal. I would probably give my left arm just to talk to him.
Well, I think Jeff is probably a little bit more approachable than Tom
Okay.
Waits.
Yeah,
Rebel Spirit.
probably.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, Rebel Spirit Radio. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, good impersonation there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tom's awesome. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious though, how would this idea of kind of staying with Wargo for a moment, this idea, I think the way he phrases it is that we're kind of remembering the future in a sense.
Hmm.
How would that play in, for example, with flying saucers? Because I think
Right.
that's also a really good example of how narrative shapes what is perceived.
Right. Well, I made it a point to talk to Eric face to face like we're doing right now because like so much of this book could sort of be viewed as almost antagonistic to his work, and that's not the case because I have such a
Yeah.
deep amount of respect for his work, and like I try to make it a point at several several locations in the book to be like, look, retrocausality, I think, is a thing. Like Eric has done his homework, but my main concern with that, and I have an idea after speaking with him where he's eventually going with his thesis on this question. But like, okay, so there's this retrocausality of like, the precognition doesn't create the event, and the event doesn't create the precognition. It's sort of a loop. That's where time loops comes from. But like, what's at the center of that donut hole? I think is the real question. Like, from whence does this idea come? It's the well. Again, Eric would not say that it is a paradox, but it's the paradox inherent in so many time travel stories. I got this great equation for myself in the future. Okay, well, where'd the equation come from?
Right.
So, and in that, I just see such an interesting parallel to basically the story that we hear from so many world mythologies and religions. Like, in the beginning there was creative thought, there was speech, there was story. Like that was sort of the flashpoint for reality. As far as what that means with the flying saucers, like Eric is very clear on the fact that he doesn't think that every mystery needs to tie into the UFO question, and I admire his respect. I respect his clarity on that. But I do think that in a way, like the whole flying saucer mythos, and yeah, I'm not going to say UAP, sorry.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
whole
that's fine.
the whole UFO flying saucer mythos is its sort of own loop, right? It's this dialogue between sightings and culture and our fictions. And I honestly don't know what lies at the center of that loop either, because every time I went looking for an earlier fictional precedent for something that you see in UFO encounters, I would find the fictional precedent, and then I would find an earlier, historical precedent, even if it was from, a separate domain like religion or, just the supernatural, whatever. But then you kind of keep going back and forth. Oh no, history was first. Oh no, art was first. And I would argue that you kind of go back to petroglyphs, right? And you look at those and you're like, is this art or is this a representation of, lived experience, or is it so far back and so muddled that it really doesn't matter? And I think that might be kind of a lesson that could be applicable to the retrocausality question too, is that we are sort of embedded in this space of everywhere, every when, everything everywhere all at once, I guess. That informs all of our decisions. And, I think that is the mystical way of playing with a lot of what the quantum physicists and advanced theoretical physicists want us to buy into.
Okay, yeah, because it's interesting when we think about this is that, when I reference flying saucers, it's going back to like Kenneth Arnold, and he never said that it was a flying saucer. It was misreported, but then all of a sudden people began seeing flying saucers.
Right. And that's so
And
important. That's such an important detail. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and so it does kind of beg this question, but it also expands to other aspects of the phenomenon.
Right.
I would imagine that, like with Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and I don't know, I haven't read where the footprints end yet. I will get to it. But I imagine that you would have something similar, that maybe there were these older stories, but then you start, getting these reports, and then people's experiences start matching the reports, perhaps?
Well, yeah, and that's part of the argument that I would make, is that by definition, cryptids reside in stories. Like, we have some ephemeral evidence for them, but like if you look up a definition of a cryptid, it's going to say it features in stories or mythologies or indigenous lore. And I think that the point is, for me, the only way that I can sort of settle myself on this is to say that if you can trace these things back to, specific cultural mythologies, that like it's the petroglyph question again, right? Like, neither one nor the other, it just sort of is. And yeah, I think that a case can be made. This is one of my favorite parts of the book, so I'm just going to go ahead and go
Yeah,
there.
go for it.
I think that a case can be made that, like, yes, just like the UFO seems to stay one step ahead of us and adopt all of our expectations and sort of evolve as our culture evolves, the Bigfoot phenomenon seems to exhibit some of those attributes as well. I don't want to overemphasize this, because obviously a lot of this is prefigured in indigenous, testimony. But, I'll be damned if a lot of these modern Bigfooters aren't describing something that closely matches the antagonist from the 1987 motion picture Predator.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's the kind of thing that, like, when you say that, like, it sounds like, okay, you are really crazy, but I just the list of things that I see is pretty startling. You know, you've got some of the superficial stuff, like how tall the entity is and how it sometimes supposedly leaps among trees, like, you know, the Predator does and Bigfoot does. It's sort of, you see that gliding motion of the creature in the first film, and it looks a lot like people saying Bigfoot has this gliding motion and
Mm.
supernatural strength association with UFOs. But then it gets a little bit too specific for me to be comfortable. Like, you've got, you know, this, I've found plenty of stories in Footprints volume, I think two, that involve like a droning sound or a humming sound in conjunction with Bigfoot, which we see across all the phenomenon. And, you know, whenever you flash to the POV of the predator in the film, you've got this droning sort of warble underneath it.
Mm.
Speaking of the predator's vision, that's infrared. And one of the things that a lot of Bigfooters have started saying is that the reason we don't get more pictures of Sasquatch on trail cams is because they can somehow detect the cameras. Perhaps they can see in infrared. I'm like, okay, this is getting really specific. But then you have these stories of Bigfoot cloaking, and what every time, without fail, do people compare it to? They say it looked like Predator. You know, there are a couple of examples in the book, or at least one example in the book, of someone who sort of had PTSD from watching Predator in the theater because it so closely resembled the way that Bigfoot behaved and acted and moved. But, you know, one of the cherries on top is the fact that Kevin Peter Hall played the Predator in the film, and just a couple months later, that same summer, he played Harry in Harry and the Hendersons. And it's like, what are the odds? You know what I mean? So this sounds silly, and
Mm.
obviously, like, there are illusions, again, as I said, there are illusions amongst various tribes that these creatures can go invisible, like you do see that sort of thing. So I don't know if I can sort of draw as clear a line between that and between Bigfoot adopting the predator mythos and UFOs adopting pulp depictions of things. But at the same time, like, if we are sort of looking at an every win, then maybe that's the answer. I don't know, but I just know that something that can cloak and perhaps see an infrared and, you know, and mimics people, that's another one. You know, one of
Yeah.
the things that people will say that Bigfoot is like the best mimic in the world, and that's one of the
Mm.
ways that the predator lures in prey. So, like, I see all these things. Whether or not the phenomenon is actually doing this, or people are ascribing it to the phenomenon subconsciously, I can't say. But I think that there's something there between these two
Yeah.
modalities. Yeah.
Yeah. The question that comes to my mind in regards to this is, and I think you were just kind of hitting on this a bit, is that if, say, for example, I'm out, you know, I'm in Colorado now, say I'm out in the woods up in the mountains somewhere, and I have this Bigfoot experience, and I give this report of it, and it may match some of the things of the predator. I'm not consciously thinking about that. I'm not consciously putting it together. And what about people who may never have seen Predator? Is it somehow that this idea of the Predator getting connected to Sasquatch is just sort of out there? And I kind of want to take it to this area, into this realm of imagination, which I think we call the imaginal.
I mean, yeah, great questions. Those are the most compelling cases that I find, or when people, I mean, there's an example from earlier in the book when talking about UFOs where post Adamski's photographs, but pre Adamski being widely believed as a hoaxer, people were seeing Adamski scout craft and then supposedly had not seen Adamski's photos. Like, so
Okay.
you do get that sort of thing. A similar thing happened with Ed Walters' Gulf Breeze model. So it does seem like people are tapping into this stuff independently. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that these fictions really tap into something archetypal that is always lurking in the background that we just sort of, it's easy, it's a rut that's easy to stumble into, to fall
Mm.
into? Or does it mean like what you suggested before I started rambling, which was, is this somehow, are these ideas somehow always out there, independent
Mm.
of us? And that does bring us into discussions of something like an imaginal realm, a term used by Frederick Myers, but also employed by Henri Corbin to describe this sort of realm of, I would say, a realm of archetypes, but it's one of those things that you ask everybody, you get sort of a different
Yeah.
definition. But to me, the imaginal would be a place where all these ideas do exist, and you see allusions to this concept throughout a variety of different thinkers. I mean, One of my favorite examples is the creator of Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, who said that, the idea of Mary Poppins, like so many ideas, sort of floated to her like a balloon ideas, sort of. And you hear this among creatives, right? Like, Tolkien said that he didn't invent Middle Earth, he sort of discovered Middle Earth. There's this sense of uncovering something that's always there. And it's one of those things that I talk to creatives and they're like, yeah, like this, like my best stuff doesn't come from me. But and that automatically puts me in the mindset of a quote that's apocryphally attributed to Carl Jung, which is, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And don't know if he said that or not. It's been attributed to a lot of different people, but I think that that feels true to me. And again, so much of this book is about what feels true rather than me like presenting
Right.
ironclad evidence, because this is sort of a loosey-goosey kind of thing we're dealing with here.
Yeah. No, I appreciated it very much. Like I said, I'm a fan of Jeffrey Kripal, and I have had interest in, the phenomenon. We didn't call it the phenomenon when I was younger.
Right. It's the hip new thing is to call it the phenomenon.
Yeah. And I think that, and I appreciate that, because when we say the phenomenon, it connects all these different things that normally have been put into their own sort of separate categories.
Well, see, now I have to say, like, I appreciate it too. In my, in my rich fantasy life, everyone's saying Fortiana, but that's a little bit too rarefied. So I'll take the phenomenon. Yeah, I agree. It's a better term than the supernatural, which so many people want to exclude Bigfoot and UFOs from, and that's like, no, that's part of this too.
Yeah. Well, it gives us a much richer picture, I think, and allows us to make those connections.
Yeah, because so much, that's the thing that I guess that's the foundation of everything I talk about, really, is this sort of like putting these things in dialogue with each other, this sort of interdisciplinary, interconnected approach. And like you get as far along, you get 10 years into it, I guess, right? Like I have. And, you start to see those buzzing sounds at the beginning of so many experiences. You start to see missing time, even encrypted experiences and some, ghost stories. And it's like, I don't know if these things are the same thing. I can't lay claim to that sort of certainty. But what I can say is that it certainly seems like those Venn diagrams overlap a lot more than they should if we're dealing with a flesh and blood monkey in the woods and a nuts and bolts spacecraft from Zeta Reticuli.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things I find really interesting is that I think that all of this is forcing us to reevaluate, in a sense, our metaphysics, our ontology about what exactly is real. And it frustrates me, and this is why I love Kripal's work, is that he's like, well, no, we need to include all of this when we talk about religion. And I forget, I think it was Jack Hunter had a phrase somewhere. I've got it in one of my 8 pages.
Yeah, he talks about, Jack is such a smart guy, and I love his insights. And he describes religion as the domesticated paranormal.
Yes. That was the quote. Yes,
and
thank you.
And it's so refreshing, because I experience resistance from religious folks, of which ironically I consider myself. Anyway, like not everybody can quite understand my approach, when I'm talking to them. But whenever I say that, it seems a light bulb seems to blink on over people's heads. And I love that. And I think that the idea of like being inclusive about these topics, that's something that Charles Fort sort of foresaw, right? The dominant of wider inclusions. And that's what we're sort of rushing headlong in towards, is this not saying like, it's those damned facts, right? We've got to sort of incorporate those as well if we're truly going to understand what reality is and what this thing is asking us to do, which I think is to interface with that level of reality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you write, that when you look at the phenomenon looks back at you.
Right, and that's also like the heart. Like that's if there's one thing that like I hope that everybody gets out of this, it's that kernel, because the idea of these characters breaking the fourth wall and fourth wall phantoms. Do you want me to ramble? Because I can ramble here. If you
please
want me to ramble.
Feel free to ramble a little bit.
That's what really sort of congealed. And interestingly enough, we're talking about Jack and Jack Hunter's Deep Weird is where this idea first came to me. So put a pin in that. What is the fourth wall? It's in theater, it's this idea that, there are definitely 3 walls, but there's an invisible fourth wall between the characters / actors and the audience. And whenever the characters or actors acknowledge the audience, that is breaking the fourth wall. And this idea can be extended to literature, where narrator or a character acknowledges the reader. Certainly in film, the Deadpool series is a great
Yeah.
modern example of that, where the characters on screen are acknowledging the audience. I would argue that Mel Brooks does it just about as good as anybody else. But it's actually a highly contentious, controversial, much debated point among narratologists, this idea of debating the fourth wall. And what they don't use that term so much as they use the term metalepsis.
Right.
And that's where we refer to like fourth wall breaks as being meta. That's where it refers. That's what it refers to. And there are various types of this. I cannot bore you with all of them because there are books upon books of essay collections of breaking the fourth wall. That can be the narrator talking to the characters. That's a metalepsis. Characters talking to the audience. Even things like crossovers could be considered metalepsis, right? Where you have a character from Golden Girls appearing on some other series. But within that, I perceive something that has been talked about a lot in studiers of the phenomenon, which is this idea that when you look at the paranormal looks back at you. In my life, I've found that true to varying degrees. It's come and gone, but I think that there is something to the idea that once you start looking for this stuff, it starts looking back at you. And that idea of like turning and facing the audience and acknowledging that the reality you're embedded in is not what it seems, and that there are forces beyond the stage that are involved, observing, or perhaps even orchestrating, seems to me like the perfect metaphor for the paranormal. And it's really completely changed the way that I view the phenomenon. And to that extent, like you can take some of these essays on metalepsis and like swap out metalepsis for the phenomenon or the paranormal, and it reads the same, because it is all about sort of realizing that it's that transgression of hierarchies of reality that we see in states of transcendence, and that a lot of, I would argue, paranormal experiences are sort of calls to pursue. Another good concrete example of this is George P. Hansen's work on the trickster archetype, which he said, is chief among the trickster's characteristics, not only being mischievous and being humorous, but also transgressing boundaries and breaking boundaries. So Deadpool is a trickster. Like that's what he is. Or more to my taste as a child, like cartoon characters that will like ask a question and they'll climb the question mark that comes above their head to reach a new destination. Like the cartoons of Tex Avery were really classics in that regard. So I've always loved those ideas, and it's like, oh yeah, you sort of you hack the system and you find your way out. But the thing that really struck me about this being the moment when I said, okay, there is something to this, is I read an essay about the presentation of characters in classical art, specifically Greek vases, if you want to be pretentious about it. And, if you imagine those in your brain, like all the figures are in profile, like they're not facing the observer of the pottery, with some notable exceptions. And those exceptions are sleepers, the dead, people in altered states of consciousness, monsters, and deities. And those tend to more often than not feature, they're forward facing on the vases. The dead, sleepers, altered states of consciousness, monsters, and deities. And I'm like, oh, that's all of the paranormal right there. Like that's the whole shebang, right? And so that idea that like, some of the foundations of Western civilization, some of those foundational works of art recognize those characters as being the ones who see beyond the frame of reality, sure as heck feels important to me.
Yeah. Well, kind of going along the same lines of what I was before, I feel that not just with like the study of religion, but just kind of philosophy in general, I think needs to take these things into account, because there's something really important. So in the book, early on, you kind of delve into some philosophical waters in terms of
much to my resistance. Those are I needed water wings, right? And I've sort of avoided diving into those waters for a long time, so I waded in a little bit.
Well, you did fine. As a philosophy instructor, you did just fine.
Okay, good. Thank you. That makes me feel a lot better.
Way better than most of my students do.
Okay.
Which probably is a reflection on me rather than on them. But you do talk about, because that is one of the ongoing questions in philosophy, what is real? And You talk about like the dual aspect monism, and there's the dualism that we're all used to, which is that there's like two realities or two substances, mind and matter. And you also get into panpsychism and idealism. Now, you don't include it in here necessarily. You do talk about it later, but you don't include it in the philosophical, because my guess is because it's typically seen as more religious idea, but it's animism.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's well, there's so much. I would probably describe myself. My editor Barbara Fisher has sort of described me as a Christian animist, and
Okay.
I'll take on that. I'll take on that label happily. The term animism has such a history of sort of being misused and abused.
Right.
And fortunately, there's some in indigenous communities who have sort of reclaimed that title, and I am all for it because I do think that view of reality is something that I've long sympathized with. Like, for whatever reason, ever since I was a kid, like I used to feel sad for the toys on the clearance shelf, at the bargain
Yeah.
basement store, because it's like, oh, these toys are somehow sad. So, yeah, I think that's what so much of philosophy tends to do. I don't know if you'll disagree with this, but there are these sort of indigenous modalities of thinking about and engaging with the world that the philosophical quadrant of academia has sort of reinvented the wheel on. And that's part of the reason that I ended up sort of saving a lot of the indigenous perspectives on the separation between fact and fiction to the very end, because like there's that meme. Have you seen that meme where it's it shows the opening frames of a film, and it's like the character makes a decision that's gonna
Oh yeah,
wrap
yeah,
everything up tidily, like Indiana Jones says, well, I guess I'll just let them take the Ark of the Covenant, and
yeah.
the same outcome happens, right? That's kind of what I was afraid would happen, because some of those ways of thinking about the separation between reality and fiction are so important, and so wrap these things up so tidily with a bow. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to talk about it or you were willing to talk about it now, but this idea amongst the Amazonian tribes of Ibupiu, do you remember that section?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Daniel Everett, linguist, spent some time as a missionary with the Piraha tribe in the Amazon, and they were so literalist about the way that they interpreted things that he actually ended up sort of losing his religion, because he kept on hearing this word be appended to certain phrases, like he Ibupio on the canoe down the river, or she Ibupio into the forest, or this or that the other. And what he discovered after hearing this time and time again was that it was one of a staggering number of conjunctions that could be applied to denote how you learned about information. So I saw him go into the forest. I deduced he went into the forest. I heard about him going to the forest. He said he was going to go into the forest, so that's where he is today. Like that sort of thing. But what I found really interesting was the fact that, like, on one occasion, Everett had lost his flashlight, or his flashlight batteries had died, and he lit a match. And as it's flickering in and out, as the flame is flickering in and out, the people with him said, "Oh, the flame is ibupiwing. It's blinking, winking, blinking or winking it out of existence." And here's the sticking point. So keep that in mind. But here's the sticking point. The Piraha have a spiritual life. This tribe of literalists still acknowledge the existence of spirits, to the extent that, like, he was on the shore one time and his primary language instructor was like, don't go out today. Don't you see the sky person? They're saying that if you go out into the jungle, they're going to kill you. And he's like, I didn't see anything. And Everett kind of, like, dances around that, like, oh, they're interpreting this as spirits or that as spirits. But I'm like, no, like you just said that these people were literalists. And so I think that if you take that idea of the flame sort of flickering in and out, and Ibupiuing, I think that these things Ibupiu. Like, I think that maybe that might be a way to look at them. Like, they are no less real when you're seeing it, and no more real than when they're not there. It's kind of like asking the question, like, is the tornado real? Like, well, yeah, but it's not anywhere in America right now. At the time of recording this, like, no one's reporting one. But there are conditions for which in the moment it can be real, and then afterwards it's not real, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen and it wasn't there for that fleeting glimpse. So that's not quite an animist discussion, but it sort of does broach the topic into how there are other ways of thinking about this sort of false dichotomy that we've set up.
Yeah.
Which does speak to something a little bit more monist, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in terms of the philosophy, I think that there's these arbitrary divisions between what is philosophy and what is religion, or what's
Mm-hmm.
spiritual. And I always like to try to challenge those categories because there's so much embedded in them. But one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is, and you quoted him a couple times. I didn't go through I look at the bibliography to see which works you were looking at, but in terms of idealism, at one point I think that you quote Bernardo
Mm-hmm.
Kastrup. And one of the things that came to my mind while reading your book, and I was hoping that I would have enough time to go back and read Kastrup's book on decoding Jung's metaphysics, because I thought that there was something in that that spoke to what you were doing. Because if I understand correctly, kind of going into Kastrup and Jung here for a second, is, because Kastrup's an idealist and he makes the case that Jung is too. And we have this dichotomy of conscious and unconscious. But if I understand correctly from memory here, that it's really part of one field and we're just experiencing the conscious. And that doesn't mean that there's unconsciousness, but you have this realm of archetypes and perhaps other things, because Jung certainly had these experiences. And it seems like that kind of model really speaks, in my mind, to what you're trying to argue in your book.
Yeah, I think, if I can sort of approach this in my own
Yeah,
autodidactic,
please.
feeble sort of way, one of the things one of the metaphors that Jung employed about synchronicity was that it was something like the bedrock of the ocean. And every now and then an island, breaks the surface of the ocean and we perceive it as an island, but no, it's just an extension of the bedrock that's all around. And
Right.
I think an argument can be made that that's sort of the false dichotomy of conscious and unconscious. Like, I think that
Yeah.
these little individual of consciousness that we think we have when we have our egos are just ways of sorting and filing
Yeah.
this underlying stratum. And I see a lot of parsimony between that view of the collective unconscious and Kastrup's work from what I am able to understand, right?
Yeah.
And that's always the caveat.
Yeah.
And I try to be very clear in the book about, like, I'm doing my best here, folks. Like, like, please.
Yeah.
And that I thought it was very important. Well, we can talk about the first person later if you want to, but I thought it was
Yeah.
very important to sort of acknowledge those feelings, because there's only so much that you can make yourself aware of when writing a book like this. But but everything that I've heard from Kastrup, I think that he's onto I would qualify myself as more of an idealist. So maybe that's what I am. Like, maybe I'm a Christian animist with idealist sympathies, or a Christian idealist with animist sympathies, or something like that. But yeah, I think that idea of and that idea of our consciousness sort of filtering and processing is very much in line with a lot of consciousness studies writ large, and a lot of ideas looking into altered states of consciousness and the non-locality of consciousness. And I think an argument can be made that that non-locality is beaming in from something like the collective unconscious, or like this idealist stratum that people like Kastrup talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I see that idealism and animism are entirely consistent. So I don't see any
I
problem
mean,
with
yeah,
that.
that's my suspicion, is that these issues play well together, play better together than a lot of us really apprehend,
Yeah.
and that there is a way to sort of reconcile all these things.
Yeah. Well, it begs the question to me, though, is those moments of the island erupting, as it were, w- why do we experience those? What's behind that? Is there a purpose behind it? Is it just random? Is there an because as I was reading the book too, and these are narratives, I'm like, well, in part we're writing the stories, but isn't there, it seems like there's another author elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, this is felt and not
Yeah,
deduced,
yeah,
which is sort of
sure.
the mantra of fourth wall phantoms. But, like, I would suspect that it happens, those moments when the island does erupt, when the proper conditions are met. I think by
Yeah.
definition that would have to be the case. And those conditions, I am not one to say, but I would say that it's almost like a sympathetic vibration between
Mm.
one's intention and the plot, or maybe these archetypal forms. It's like, oh, you're in the groove, right? Like,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
sine waves are lining up,
Mm.
and in sound, sine waves can cancel each other out or they can amplify, right? I'm sounding like a new ager, aren't I?
A little bit. That's
But
okay.
I think, as a metaphor, that might be something that we're seeing. And that was sort of a lot of what Jung would talk about with sort of psychoid processes and synchronicities in general, is that there was sort of an alignment with the exterior and the interior, and
Hmm.
that could possibly be reframed as an alignment between the conscious and the unconscious too.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jung, if I remember correctly, said that the archetypes they're autonomous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I spilled a good little deal of ink
Yeah.
trying to pin down exactly what an archetype was, and I was
Right.
relieved to find out that even Jung used that term pretty inconsistently.
Right. Right. Right.
Again, I keep on saying felt not deduced, but it's also that Supreme Court ruling on obscenity, like you know it when you
Mm.
see it, right?
Right. 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 Yeah.
And yeah, I think the autonomy is self-evident to me because I have met people who have never and will never read a word of Carl Jung,
Mm.
and they'll probably never consciously register the word archetype, but
Mm.
they are some of the strongest archetypes I've ever met,
Yeah.
which again sort of precludes the retrocausality
Mm.
component, right? I mean,
Right.
that's one of the biggest places that I depart with Eric Wargo, is that he in his latest book, especially From Nowhere, which is fantastic, but he mentions a patient of Kalshid, the Jungian analyst, who has this revelatory dream, and the in Kalshid finds these archetypes in a book and shares it with the patient, and Eric's like, oh well, the patient had that dream because it was reacting to the positive feedback from his psychoanalyst telling him
Mm.
that. And I'm like, but again, you have these people who never go through Jungian
Mm.
analysis, but will have these dreams that still carry that same symbolic potency, and
Mhm.
who do embody the mother or the warrior or the trickster, and they never immerse themselves in Jungian analysis and never go to therapy. So I think that there's that autonomy and pre-existence of archetypes for me is goes without saying. But I can certainly see why some people would object to that.
Mm.
I just think that these things do seem to sort of exhibit that sort of autonomy that we would expect from something that is completely divorced from retrocausality or our own
Mm.
projections.
Yeah.
Now the
Well,
question then becomes like, can they take form, right? And that's another
right.
thing where
Right.
I'm like, okay, let's try to engage with this the best we can. And I don't know really where I wound up, but like,
Yeah.
I'm willing to entertain the idea that an archetype can become embodied, or at
Mm.
least be perceived by someone as embodied.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people can become, and I think Jung talked about this. People can become possessed by the archetypes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have experienced a bit of that myself around the Thanksgiving table when I'm trying to start some mess, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm being the trickster. But yeah, there's a read on possessions, demonic possessions, that there's no, you know, dark elder intelligence that's possessing someone. It's just people letting their shadow sort of, overtake them and consume them.
Yeah. 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 But, and it's interesting. I mean, what just came to mind, I do have something I want to take us to, but what just came to mind was Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos and the
Right.
Necronomicon, and how that began as a work of fiction, but then there was a published Necronomicon, and people began some people began believing that it was an actual text. And I know that some chaos magicians may
Mhm.
use that sort of same mythology in their work, but again, just kind of pointing to the that often there's not a strict line between fiction and fact.
Right. And that might be, I mean, it pains me to my religious friends and family will hear this and they will think that I'm a true heretic, but it means so much more to me than this. That might be the story of religion in general,
Mm,
is
yeah.
that there are these sort of fictions that get taken up and become a reality for individuals.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, like, as as a practicing Christian, I don't see that as all that heretical when you've got a book that starts with, in the beginning there was the word, and, and you've
Right.
got everything kicking off
Yeah.
from story, right? Like that's
Yeah.
these are sort of creative endeavors that take on a life of their own and take their own sort of meaning from that. But yeah, the Lovecraft thing is interesting because it's so astounding to me that a work of patent fiction can sort of can attain this sort of dubious status in between, like, oh, was he really tapping into something strange, or
Right. Right.
was it real? I mean, it's something that I guess if you're old enough, you remember this, like those days when the Blair Witch Project came out, right? And it was
Yeah. Yeah.
it was a very similar thing, where if you were paying attention, like it was never up in the air as to whether or not that was an actual recording of people lost in the woods. Like it was always a film,
Yeah.
but the way it sort of took itself up in the popular imagination was sort of straddling that line between fact and fiction, with some people believing that it was true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that in terms of religion in general, I don't identify necessarily with any religion. Probably closest is with Buddhism, but I have a background in it. I teach it on occasion. And I think that there's something, and I think this is important for what you're writing in the book, because you do talk about sort of the self-made gods, right? And I think that is something that's really important with, for example, the biblical God. When we look at Genesis, most ancient mythologies have a genealogy of the gods, and sometimes there's just one God that just kind of manifests somehow. But
It's that pesky word Elohim, right?
Yeah.
In Genesis, like, what does that mean?
Yeah. But, I think that what's the point I was trying to make is that in the biblical text, God just is. And
Right.
with what you have been saying and kind of what you were writing in the book as well, in some sense, and, it doesn't have to be associated with any particular divinity necessarily, but it seems like maybe that's what's at the center of the whole of those time loops, that there is this just self-existing existence, if it were. I don't know how else to explain it.
Right. Well, I mean, and yeah, that I mean, by definition, that kind of has to be what it is, right? If we
Yeah.
accept ideas of this loopiness of time or something.
Yeah.
Eric uses the phrase ex nihilo, which is like from nothing, but like,
Right.
yeah, it's from nothing, but it's also from the always that ever was. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think if you sort of look at it, I think a void is a void, right? But a void is
Right.
also everything,
Hmm.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
it does encompass the totality of what it's trying to be. So yeah, I think that you're right in that regard, and that's an interpretation that I would certainly sympathize with. And I think that is a confrontation of how we have perceived time and these sort of, I argue that there's a sort of a narrative form to a lot of things, and there's an archetypal sort of story form, but at the same time, we do have a tendency to graft narratives onto things that don't have narratives. So I think that might speak to that as well.
Yeah. One of the things that you noted in the book, and I wanted to address this maybe in the sense that the larger narratives that are happening here, but you wrote that strong arguments that UFO encounters in general, alien abductions in particular, closely correspond to shamanic initiations. And I see an initiatory aspect in a lot of investigations into the phenomena. The one thing that really kind of jumped out at me was Greg and Dana Newkirk's series Hellier, especially the second season, where they come to the conclusion that they're being initiated. And there seemed to be this kind of question as to who's behind this. But I kept thinking, I don't think there's any person behind this at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also probably a question as to who's being initiated too, right? Like, is the
Yeah.
audience being initiated? I
Right.
think that's a big question. But yeah, it could almost be understood as like an epiphenomena, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that these things sort of arise when significant spookiness levels are
Yeah.
attained. I mean, and this sort of brings you into the idea of inventing things from whole cloth, like the Philip experiment, and like, the way
Yeah.
that hoaxes seem to tease out genuine phenomenon. I agree with you. I resonate strongly with the idea that so many of these things are sort of initiatory. I have to. I've been sort of seeding this idea. Maybe I've been initiating people, right? I've been seeding this idea across some interviews because I didn't engage with it, but I think ufology as a community is going to have to acknowledge and sort of like rethink a lot of the things that we've thought, because that sort of typical alien abduction narrative that is so overtly shamanic, with literal dismemberment and reassembly and, with foreign objects in your body, like those sort of
Yeah.
things, doesn't happen that much anymore.
Hmm.
I've heard this from numerous people who are field investigators, that a lot of what we're seeing now are more explicitly astral travel and downloads and contact in general,
Hmm.
but not like, oh, I feel like I was bodily taken aboard a ship and taken apart. And I think that there is a way to sort of square that with the shamanic archetype, because not every shaman is a shaman, right? Like, that's a
Right, right.
problematic term, and not every shamanic initiation is attained the same way,
Yeah.
right? So like, so I think that there is a way to square this sort of new expression of contact against these older modalities, but I also think that we sort of need to get a template for what that looks like. So hopefully, there are great minds on the case,
Yeah.
but I think that's something that's important to sort of cast an eye towards the future, because it does seem to me that the phenomenon is in one of these sort of transitory phases.
Yeah.
By which I mean, back in 2017, when we were sort of started becoming inundated with the Tic Tac video, I said to one of my friends, I said, "Oh, okay, so UFOs are going to be drones now, like because they were airships, and then they were flying saucers, and then they were black triangles, and then none of those forms really go away, but like it's just adding to the repertoire." And I'm like, "Oh, because we got drones now." And my friend in the years since has been like, "Yeah, but we're not getting a lot of drone stories. We're not getting a lot of drone stories." And then December of last year
Yeah.
happened, and regardless of what that was in the skies above, the northeastern United States, the idea of drone and UFO has been conflated in our imagination. So as it is there, so it appears, right? And I think that is something that we'll continue to see more of, is this idea of like, I saw a mystery drone, must be a UFO.
Hmm.
And also, I'm not ignoring the possibility that we're in sort of a sea change, or we're due for a sea change in terms of the way that the occupants are presented, because
Hmm.
we can sort of write this continuum of demons and or the dead to the fairies to the aliens,
Hmm.
and now, like, are we going to get AI bots coming from their underground server farms to
Yeah.
to abduct us and upload our consciousness? Like, what is the next phase of this? What does this look like next? Or is Mike Masters' extratemporal model going to take root, and we're going to see even more human looking UFO occupants as visitors from the
Hmm.
future? I don't know, but I think as the shape of the craft has evolved and adapted, I think we'll see the shape of the occupants do the same.
Hmm. That's interesting. And I'm curious, this isn't something in the book, but just on what you said about the drones in December, I was thinking about that a couple weeks ago, because there was all of this, online, YouTube, and even in, regular news. It's like, oh, there are all these drones, and we would hear that the government wasn't freaked out about them. They're like, don't worry, don't panic, but we never got an explanation. But then all of a sudden, the story just died,
Yeah.
and we never got an explanation. And I'm just curious. It's like, do you have any idea what was going on?
Well, this speaks to a couple of different things. I mean, there was sort of an answer that it was an answer in the form of a non-answer, which was a
Mm.
presser that said, "Yeah, we knew what they were, and they were authorized in our
Mm.
airspace." Was basically the answer. It's like,
Right,
okay, well, it's
right,
still not an answer.
right.
I think a lot of things were happening. I personally am of the opinion that a lot of that was terrestrial, and
Hmm.
for to what end? I think all options are on the table. But again, the point for me was that, like, if we're going to if we're going to use this terminology, the imaginal doesn't care what it was or what it wasn't.
Right,
In your
right.
imagination now, it's one and the same. I think that that's part of it. I think that people were looking into the sky for the first time in their
Yeah,
lives,
yeah.
and that's pretty evident from the number of people who misidentified things. But alongside those misidentifications and those real mystery drones, I think that there were probably some anomalies that got caught,
Mm.
because people were, again, looking to the sky to see
Yeah.
things. But as far as landing on, like, a definite interpretation of what it was, I'm not sure. I personally think
Yeah.
that it was something clandestine, because, speaking of news cycles, there was just this big release in the news that a lot of this UFO stuff, surprise, surprise, has been used to cover up,
Yeah.
shenanigans. So that's, it was ever
Mm.
thus. And people misinterpret me, what I'm saying, because they think that, like, no, Josh, they were terrestrial drones. Don't you know? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Like, I'm saying that once you latch onto that symbolism,
Mm. Right.
in the way that it did, right? In the way that it did as part of a national news cycle, international news cycle, arguably, then it's the die has been cast. Like
Right.
this is the
Right.
way that this has been added to the repertoire. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was just curious since you brought it up. I thought I would ask because I was like,
No, it's a
what,
good
what
question.
happened? What happened?
Yeah, and
Um,
I wish that it had gotten or would continue to get more exploration than it has, but here we
yeah.
are.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that came to my mind, kind of going back to the idea of initiation, and I don't know where I got this. I would use this in class at times, and I know I'm missing something. But what I kind of want to say is that what seems to be happening is, in terms of initiation, I'm dropping the shamanic. I think there's an argument to be made that almost all initiations emerge from a kind of shamanic initiation, but it seems that we are being initiated into the reality of our own psyches.
Mm. I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, and it's just I'm not sure. I mean, I'm going to pull a page from from Jeff Kripal's, corpus and just say like all it really is that initiation is just knocking down the assumptions of what is possible and impossible,
Yeah.
and just opening the door. And like that's the true fissure that gets created when you have this experience. It's that, oh, I thought the world was one way, and this experience, this firsthand experience that I cannot deny, has shown me that this one piece is definitely wrong. So what else is wrong?
Yeah.
And I have a lot to say about the post-truth era. We sort of just touched on it, right, with the non-explanation that we got.
Right.
You know, facts don't matter to anyone, and I mean that in the way that I think everybody is guilty. I had a panel a couple of years ago talking about disclosure, and I'm like, imagine the person that you didn't vote for president is now president, and they're telling you that UFOs are real. Do you believe them? And the answer is unanimously no. Like,
Yeah.
and I think that this sort of post-truth era is, for better or worse, comorbid with disclosure
Hmm.
because it sort of resides in that sort of we're not going to believe anybody, so this is the perfect time for the phenomenon to sort of give up the goods so that people still won't believe it even though it's being transparent, but also might speak to sort of that initiatory experience in the world at large. You're really pulling out the new ager in me today, but
That's not intentional.
um, but there is this like things feel more subjective than ever, I guess is what I'm
Yeah.
getting at. And
Yeah.
while that's not necessarily a space in which to make policy, that is, I think, a good place in which to live your own life.
Yeah.
I found that subjectivity for me is something that it's a mind space that encourages compassion and uncertainty, which I think is more of a virtue than we've been led
Yeah.
to believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. Uncertainty. I think that more of us need to admit to our ignorance.
Yeah.
I always Thoreau has a line, we need to remember well our ignorance. But in terms of that subjectivity, and you do address this in the book, that the case you're presenting does, in a way, allow for different individual experiences. What came to my mind when I was reading that is in Diana Pasulka's American Cosmic, she relates a story of a married couple, and there was, I forget all the details of it, but there was something in their living room. If I remember right, the wife had been like praying for a dying dog or something, and she has this experience, and the husband comes downstairs, and and again, I may be misremembering this, but she saw like a saint or something, and then he just saw like a ball of light.
Was this
They
the
both
Ray Hernandez's experience, I think?
maybe, I don't
Maybe.
remember.
Okay,
I
okay.
just remember that you had
In any
the
case, yeah.
the
Yeah.
the two people had, they experienced a phenomenon together. There was something happening, but they both experienced something very different.
Right. Yeah, and that's I think that's maybe I'm just being a real apologist for the phenomenon, but I think that there's something very attractive to me about the idea that these aren't individual experiences in terms of like, oh, this person had this experience with Bigfoot, and this person had another experience with Bigfoot, but these were separate experiences. I know, I mean, like these experiences could not get more separate if you
Right, right.
tried, because there were different people involved. So,
Hmm.
one of the things that I mentioned in the book is like, George Adamski's Venusians
Right,
exist for
right.
George Adamski and George Adamski alone. And that's like the ultimate subjectivity, right? But yeah, there is this through line that you see across a lot of different things. And you see it in the ghost stories, you
Hmm.
see it in the cryptozoological stories, and you sure as heck see it in the UFO stories. Is that, people having both agreeing that there is something anomalous happening will see and experience different things, as if they are somehow bringing an aspect of their own expectations or whatnot to that experience. And that's if that right there is an example of how our own selves, our own imaginations, our own presumptions are brought into the discussion and are allowed to sort of be made manifest. And I think that that is something that could relieve the pressure if it was embraced a little bit more, because you do get these stories of, I collected a story firsthand of a couple who both agreed that they saw something strange in the sky in Michigan. One of them said it was a giant amoeba creature floating through the sky, and the other one said it was like your prototypical Native American thunderbird. Your sorry, quintessential Native American thunderbird. Another example from Nottingham, where these two boys, one of them saw a Bigfoot and the other one saw a giant cloud donut, floating towards them. But even on a smaller level, you'll have people say, "Yeah, we both saw a UFO. Yeah, it was shaped like this. Yeah, this is how it moved, etc. Yeah, and it had red lights." The other person's like, "No, it had blue lights."
Yeah, yeah.
And these sort of points of disagreement. And I'm not exactly sure what that implies. One way to do it is to say that, oh, well, we individually have skinned these things according to
Mm,
our own subconscious desires or cultural expectations, whatever. Or, the other way is that, there is one person for whom that was meant, and the other person gets
mm.
whatever they get,
Yeah, yeah.
An idea that I've found really attractive, and it speaks to what I'm currently working on with Barbara Fisher, is the idea that, like, the only thing these things are is lights. Like, that's
Mm.
the only thing they are. Like, if you want to see the truest form of this thing, it's light.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
everything else that we've put on top of that, all the mythos of the UFO and of the cryptids and of the ghosts, like those come from us, because
Mm.
something about the light is interacting with us. And I don't know, it's unfalsifiable, but I think it's something that is worth exploring, because those lights, man, they're in everything. They are in
Yeah.
everything.
That makes me feel better because I've been, interested in all of this since I was a kid, and I've never seen a UFO craft, but I have seen lights,
Right.
and I've seen lights doing really weird things. So that makes me feel a little bit better.
Well, and
Uh,
that's a classic example, because it's like it's completely context dependent, because
yeah,
like, were those lights in the sky?
yeah,
Yeah, so if you'd seen that same thing in a house, what would you have said? You wouldn't have said UFO. You'd have
right.
said ghost.
Yeah, yeah,
If you'd seen it at the stone circle in Loch Gur, you'd have said fairies.
right.
You'd have said
Yeah,
something different every
yeah.
time. So yeah, I think that's a good example of that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. That makes me feel a lot better because I do want to see the big spaceship and stuff, but
Right, right. But
you
you but
know,
you might but you might have pierced the veil of Maya and seen the true burning reality at the heart of the phenomenon. Who knows?
okay, yeah, I'll take that.
Right.
No, I can't do that. Well, let's talk a little bit. You brought this up earlier, but let's talk about the first person in this.
Right.
This is a personal work, and I thought that, just to put it out there, it kept me engaged. I mean, it's a beast of a book,
Right.
but as I said before, I didn't find it repetitive, and I appreciated sort of the tone throughout, and it felt like you were being a very good guide to people.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, it was. Look, I mean, if I'm going to talk about dual aspect monism and Henri Corbin's realm of the mundus imaginalis and all these,
Mm,
like, these ideas, like, I feel like you got to have a guide who
mm.
is just as confused as you are.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And in a lot of my work, I've been very meticulous about
Hmm.
not putting I in there. Like, if you
Yeah.
read Ecology of Souls, there is no I until the afterword, and then that's when
Right.
I'm like, here's how I feel. But throughout that, like, you could take that in its entirety without that afterward, and it is very impartial and impersonal. But a couple of things occurred to me. First of all was not only how I'm stepping into fields with which I don't have the utmost fluency. That's the one thing. Another thing that was really important to me was that so much of this is being held up as examples in terms of like something that I feel or that I sense is right. And like you can't be impartial and be like, well, it's feels like this. I needed to have my voice in there. Another aspect of it was the fact that it felt extremely on brand for a book about breaking the fourth wall to sort of directly engage the reader and directly, sort of address the reader. But then again, the other thing is that like the book does open with my experience in 2020 in rehab for alcoholism. And it wasn't necessarily to gain sympathy points, although I'll take sympathy points whenever I can, right? For alcoholic, right? But it was to sort of emphasize the immediacy and real effects that engaging with reality as narrative, engaging with archetypes can have on your life. And I make no bones about it. Like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell like saved my life. Like that's totally what they did, because during that period, like I retreated to those stories and was like, okay, where am I? Oh, okay, belly of the whale. Okay, got this. And being like, okay, well, what do these ancient themes say about what I'm expected to do next, and how can I align myself and my maneuvers with what reality, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it, wants me to do? What is the path of least resistance for me to fall into that resonates with those stories and those themes? And then once you open a book like that, like it would be really pretentious to sort of withdraw and be like, now I'm going to be, this detached, omniscient voice. So I kept myself in there, and I thought that it was important too to like inject some humor here and there. So hopefully the humor wasn't lost. I've read some people like humor was lost on me. I'm like, well, it's not for everybody. But yeah, the tone of the book, obviously it is my voice, but the tone of the book that I sort of realized in hindsight, whether conscious or not, is sort of like if John Keel had the worldview of Jeff Kripal, like was kind of okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. That might be me in a nutshell anyway. So I'll take it.
Yeah. No, I found it to be a excellent contribution to that sort of line of thinking, and that's where I've been exploring for many years now. So I was really excited that you wrote this, because I did read Ecology of Souls. We spoke about that before.
Yeah, well, number one, thank you. As I interrupt you, thank you.
Sure.
But number two, I think that I have encountered this with other books in the past, and I'll probably encounter it here. They're like, "Oh, so you don't think any of the Ecology of Souls is true?" And I'm like, I don't think it's that simple or that easy.
Right.
Like, I think that there is a way. Again, maybe this just makes sense to me, but there's a way in which Fourth Wall Phantoms nests into Ecology of Souls pretty well, because so much of what do are these things linked with the dead because there's literally this objective mechanism by which we transfer to the afterlife, or is it because of how our beliefs are expressed about the dead, and recede when you die, you recede into the imaginal, and that's why you live in people's hearts. I don't know, but I think that there is something to that, to the extent that like I would certainly say that if there is such a thing as the imaginal realm, it probably is synonymous with the spirit realm. Like I think that seems completely consistent in my warped version of reality.
Yeah. Well, I think that came across in the book, because you also make the connection, and I think this is what you were just saying in a sense, is that you make the connection to art. And where exactly are artists getting their ideas? And sometimes it's something that they're not thinking it necessarily. It's something that kind of comes to them, and it's like, well, where does it come from? So
it comes from the center of that time loop, right? I mean, that's the thing. And not only that, but it comes as meaning. It comes as something that is inarticulable. There is that constant refrain, which I don't catalog as extensively as I could, but hopefully I provided enough examples of people having these experiences and retreating to this position of there are no words, it defies language. There aren't words to express this, and the only way that you can express this is, I think, in art.
Yeah.
And I think the life of every experiencer is kind of its own little mini work of art.
Yeah. Well, and I always make the case that that's what religion is, in a sense. All of them is, an attempt to give form to the ineffable, to that which is indescribable. And I actually have that written down on my notes here, ineffable.
It's probably why we cringe so hard at bad religious art, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
it's got to be good art, or and that's a quote that I think Jeff made, which is religion is art that doesn't know it's art, and that seems flippant until you sort of understand the esteem with which a lot of us hold art.
Yeah.
And that sort of in between space between the art and the person consuming it. That's such a YouTube word. Why am I even using that? Between the art and the audience. That space of meaning, I think, is where the real magic happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It all goes back to, at the end, you noted, and I think this is kind of where the important point is, and this is a direct quote from the book: I suspect that the paranormal, supernatural, imaginal, near-death experience, shamanic, and psychedelic spaces are identical to the artistic space. Pure creativity. A place of unbridled imagination, free from language's constraints. And I think that point of pure creativity is important, and that kind of takes us back to the center of the loop. And if there is an awareness or a consciousness, call it God, of whatever you want, I always like to take, the Genesis, when, we're made in the image of God, that God's a creator and therefore we are creators too. Right. And that is where divinity resides.
It's that old lesson of the universe wanting to experience itself. It's the spark of the divine within us. And something that I always want to try to stress whenever this part of the conversation comes up is that you don't have to be Scorsese or Michelangelo to be a creative person, right? Like the most boring person in the world still makes creative decisions. And granted, they probably have the opportunity to be more creative, but they still, even everyday problem solving is sort of its own creativity. So this is not a gatekeeping sort of thing. It's that spark within us that allows us, I think, to function, is that creative spark.
Yeah. Well, it seems like our lives, the world that we live in, is detrimental to allowing that to happen. One of my, or I shouldn't say one of my favorite director has always been David Lynch, since I saw The Elephant Man when I was a little kid. And I remember there's a documentary on him, The Art Life. And, what he would do is he just kind of expressed the importance of having the time to just sit and let your mind wander. And
he was a fisherman of ideas too.
Yeah,
like he employed that metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like that, we don't have that luxury so much. And I'm curious, with that kind of train of thought and the experiences of the phenomenon, and I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm kind of curious of whether or not these, the eruptions of the island, are they occurring more often than not in those moments where someone is not involved in day-to-day activities? Because it seems like that may be the time when whatever the phenomena is can best speak to us.
Right. Well, I'm of two minds about this. Like, you're not going to find an island in the desert, right?
Right.
But at the same time, my joke that I always tell is that, I don't know if it's a bad joke, it's not even a good joke, but like, I do my best writing between the computer and the fridge. Like, like when I stop thinking about the problem that I'm trying to hammer out, and take my mind off of it and focus my mind on something very pragmatic, is when the perfect phrase will come into my head or something along those lines. So I think it probably ties more into this idea of the filter of consciousness, or the filter of our brains filtering consciousness, functions at its most uninhibited when it's not being controlled, right? It's less rigid in those moments when we actually, Jesus, take the wheel, right? Or consciousness, take the wheel. And so I suppose that might be something of an answer. Having said that, it's also probably a bit like psychic abilities and artistic abilities, like I've heard this comparison made numerous times, but I tend to agree that it's true, is that, there are people who are predisposed to be very talented drawers,
Mm.
and there are people who are predisposed to be very talented psychics. I think both of those attributes you can be gifted with. You can also learn them to be better honed than if you don't. So
Mm.
I think giving it a little bit of attention can be useful, but there does come a certain point where you have to sort of let the something else take over. You have to sort of
Mm.
allow yourself to fall into the center of that loop.
Okay. One of the questions that I have is, again, I loved the book and I tend to think towards these lines anyway, but how does this, I don't know, affect or help, or I don't know, the larger community of people who are investigating the phenomenon? And maybe I can ask kind of in conjunction with that is what has been the response from that community towards your book?
I think that the most salient takeaway for people who are sort of investigating and trying to get to the bottom of this is probably this chapter that I have that focuses on what I call folklore and superposition, which is this idea. It's not quite an accurate a term as I could have invented, but it's this idea of refusing to categorize and label these things. So, like,
Mm.
I have known of. There's a classic example. I had a friend who was speaking with an experiencer whose car was pursued. I think I've mentioned this in a couple places, but an experiencer whose car was pursued by an orb of light, and when they got home, they pulled into the driveway, and there's this like 3 foot tall plaid rabbit standing in front of the garage door, and like the rabbit doesn't make it into the UFO investigators story, right?
Mm.
Because that doesn't
Right.
have anything to do with UFOs. And so the idea of like refusing to categorize these things, holding them in the state of indeterminacy, I think allows you to be more aware of patterns and such that you might see. And indeed, that might even be the way that these things are. Like, there's not a UFO category and a Bigfoot category and a ghost category and a lake monster category. Like, there aren't these categories. It just all sort of is, and then we, metaphorically as observers, sort of snap it into a box and a category. So I think that is a lesson that can be really useful, especially if someone just sort of stays in their own lane and doesn't ever venture into a parallel discipline. Now, the question of how it's received, I mean, I get the feeling that a lot of the people who have read Fourth Wall Phantoms so far are I'm kind of preaching to the choir a bit. But as far as reception, like obviously I want to see people enjoy my work, but I always try to write things that I would want to read. And to that extent, like I would want to read this, and I'm glad I wrote it, and got some stuff off my chest. I mean,
Yeah.
there are more opinions in this book than anything else I've written. Like
Yeah.
there's some axes get ground, right? But I think that this book has sort of encapsulated a lot of the direction that I've been thinking about and where I've arrived
Mm.
over the past 10 years. And yeah, I continue to be sort of astounded by the people who have noticed my work. I mean, you got to remember, I just had it out here the other day, but I reshelved it. I'm just a nerdy little middle schooler who plays tuba and has this copy of Jerome Clark's The Unexplained that is held together with packing tape. And Jerry's reviewed my books now. So like I'm constantly astounded by the charity and acceptance with which people have sort of engaged my work, and it it never ceases to amaze me. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm incredibly grateful for it.
Yeah.
Incredibly grateful.
Yeah. Well, it's good. I've enjoyed both of your books, and like I said, I want to get to where the footprints end.
Now
Uh,
I'm still an author, so the further
yeah.
back you
Yeah.
go in
Oh
my
yeah, for sure.
catalog, the less I'm like, yeah, that was some
Yeah.
stuff I do
Yeah.
differently. So yeah, so
Yeah, yeah,
keep that
yeah.
in
That's
mind.
okay. That's
Yeah.
okay. That's okay. And when I was a kid, I kind of dug Bigfoot. I grew up I rarely ever admit to this, but I grew up in Ohio, and we would have Bigfoot sightings in Ohio.
Oh yeah.
So that was always there, but I was always more interested in ghosts and UFOs and things like that. In fact, I wanted to, I'm going to complain here for a second. When I was a master's student, that's what I wanted to do. This was, 100 years ago. I wanted to look at UFOs in relationship to religion, because my master's is in religious studies.
That's the way to look at UFOs, I think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, the first person who had been assigned as my advisor just kind of stared at me for a moment and said, "I think you need to find something else." Yeah. So I ended up with a different advisor, and I kind of approached him, and he led me into a completely different area, which is not what I wanted to do. I began my master's thesis with the Heaven's Gate cult. That's as close as I could get with the UFOs. What frustrated me is I was recently on a plane to England, and I was reading finally George Hansen's The Trickster and the Paranormal, and all of a sudden I see my advisor's name and a article that he had published on UFOs and religion, and then reading your book, you name him too. And I was so frustrated because all these years ago I wanted to do this, and now
he's like, no, this is my domain. This is where I'm going to be.
Yeah, and he only ever did the one article,
I mean,
only the one article on it.
I mean, and here's my sort of here's my 2 cents is that you don't end up with 2 postgraduate degrees, 2 postgraduate degrees, 2 master's degrees without having some sort of affinity for the academy. So saying that, what you just said is so characteristic of a lot of my complaints about the academy,
Yeah.
This is my territory, and I'm just going to gently steer you away from this thing. Oh, it's frustrating.
Yeah, and that's actually my regret is, I always had this interest, and I see people like yourself and others who have followed it, that's been their passion, and they don't have massive amounts of student loan debt. And they've been able to do what they want, and it gets into your head. So like when I sit down to write, I'm so trained.
It's never too late. It's never too late.
Yeah, I'm trying, man. I'm trying to get rid of all that academic stuff. So, all right. Well, Joshua, I know I've kept you here for a while. We could probably talk for longer, but I kind of want to keep it, I think, where we are. I think we've ended up at a good place. Is there anything in mind of the end? Is there anything that you think is important about the book that you would like the viewers or listeners to know that we haven't approached?
I got a strange feeling when writing this book, and I don't want to, it always is sort of an awkward thing to talk about, like sort of the importance of what you do, because why are you being so presumptuous to assume it has an importance, right? But I feel like somewhere between the lines in Fourth Wall Phantoms, there might be an antidote to this era in which we find ourselves, sort of navigating that post-truth era and holding things, realizing that we may be asked to hold some of our truths with an open hand rather than a closed hand. And, again, that drumbeat of I think we summed it up well, that sort of compassion that subjectivity brings. I think that there might be a handbook in here for sort of navigating these tricky waters, because it's the trickster era. It really is. And that's a weird place to be, having been conditioned by the post-war era to think about things in terms of black and white. So that would be my hope. And, I think that there is, Fourth Wall Phantoms could not have been written in any other decade than the 2020s, I think. And to that end, I think that there's some hope to be found in there. So that would be what I'd say.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I keep complaining that we are living in a epistemological crisis because we just don't know. And it's a metaphysical crisis as well, because the two are so combined. And
it's funny how those things go hand in hand. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and my personal goal is I would love to see, like philosophy, to begin actually addressing some of these things instead of saying, well, that's just a subjective thing and we just can't really take that into account. But when you have so many subjective experiences, anecdotal evidence, with enough anecdotal evidence, it becomes data. Right. And so it seems like we are in many ways being initiated into something different.
And we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah,
I mean, like,
yeah.
that's the bad news is that you don't know which way is up. The good news is that that same not knowing which way is up is also affecting institutions that have hampered us, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, yeah,
A classic example is like I can talk about UFOs at church now. Like
yeah.
that's
Wow.
pretty shocking. Hopefully,
Yeah,
pretty awesome. Hopefully, it doesn't go sideways. It has a lot of
yeah,
potential to, but that's encouraging to me that
yeah.
people are not only becoming more fluent and comfortable with the phenomenon, but are also adopting a higher resolution interpretation of it, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it seems to me that those who not thinking in terms of religion, but those who look at all the phenomena and just kind of automatically discount it or discard it,
Right.
that when we begin taking a different view of it, then maybe that helps open up the conversation more instead of this just automatic, well, that can't happen.
Well, yeah, and to say nothing of the phenomenon responding in kind.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So, all right, what are you working on next? What do you have coming up?
I am, normally I'm really cagey about my upcoming projects, but number one, I've said this a million times before, and number two, nobody is stupid enough to tackle it except for me and Barbara. But Barbara and I are working on a books about light phenomenon in the
Okay.
paranormal, and it's something I would never have tackled without Barbara because I would venture to say that no one on planet Earth has read more books on on strange lights in the paranormal than
Yeah.
Barbara at this point. So I'm working on that. I have a couple of other projects in the back burner that, takes a long time to turn around an aircraft carrier. So we're
Yeah.
trying to get those up to
Yeah.
speed, but hopefully I'll have some news on that in the future. I am currently working on a documentary with my friend Ryan Grulick, with whom I partnered on Lady of the Lake, his film. And then around the time that this comes out, if it's if it's during August, visit my website. If it's post August, I was invited to be the workshop assistant for Dr. Kreipel's and Kevin Can's workshop at Esalen called The Soul is a UFO: Understanding and Embracing Transcendence. And that is December 5th through 7th of 2025, esalen.org. I am still trying to understand why I'm there. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's like why me? Why what qualifies me to tag along? But I'm looking forward to it, and I'm incredibly humbled and honored, and it's going to be a great time for anybody who wants to meet the three of us. We'll all be
Yeah.
there.
Have you ever been to Esalen before?
No. So like, my thing was, I would be happy to just go and take a tour and like that's
Mm.
really cool to be here, but to actually be there in some sort of official capacity as support for two people whom I admire is pretty
Yeah.
pretty awesome.
Yeah. If I were around, I would love to go to that. I've been to Esalen. My doctoral program kind of had its roots there.
Hmm.
I chose the least academic program I could find for my doctorate, but Esalen's amazing and the baths are amazing. I'll just put that out
That's what
there.
everybody keeps on saying.
Yeah.
So I'll bring the swimsuit, I guess.
Yeah. Well, just be warned, it's clothing optional down there.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll know.
yeah,
In that
yeah.
case, everybody else should be warned. But yeah.
No, no. It freed me of so many self-constraints. The first time I was there, they told us about the baths and I was like, I don't know about this whole clothing optional, but the way it was presented was kind of like, but we're secretly going to judge you if you wear clothing.
Okay.
So a friend of mine who started at the same time, we were like, okay, let's go and let's do this. And the lighting's really low, so it's almost like candlelight. And so I did it. And then the next day, I'm just like, or the next night, I only went at night. I was just walking around and it was
Nice.
fine.
All right.
But
Keep
yeah.
that in mind. I'm not sure
Yeah,
what to do with
yeah.
this information, but I'll keep it in mind.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the audience doesn't need that visual
Right.
with me, but the baths are amazing. Yeah, they're incredible. So enjoy your time. Enjoy your
I
time
will.
there. All right, and I will put a link for your website, joshuacutchin.com,
Yes, sir.
in the description, as well as links for the new book. And hopefully when you and Barbara finish your work on the light phenomena, I can speak with you again.
We'd be happy to. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So, all right. Well, Josh, thank you so much for your time and thanks for the work. I really highly recommend Fourth Wall Phantoms. It was a fun read. It was a good read. And I think it was incredibly thought-provoking too.
Thank you so much. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on episode 207 of Rebel Spirit Radio. thank you so much for listening or watching if you're part of my YouTube audience. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit that like button if you're watching on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell. You can also follow Rebel Spirit Radio on whatever audio platform you use for listening to podcasts. Right now, I have over 20,000 downloads on the audio platforms, yet I only have 13 followers, and one of those is me. It only takes a second to like, follow, or subscribe. It's totally free, and it really does help. Putting together this podcast is a labor of love. I do love it, but it is a lot of labor. So if you find value in the conversations I provide here, I hope you can find it in your heart to send a little of my way. With more subscribers and followers, I could possibly get some sponsorship, and honestly, having some funds come my way to help with equipment, hosting, and other necessary subscriptions would be really helpful. You can also help by joining my Patreon at patreon.com/rebelspirit. The link is also in the episode description. You can also buy a super thanks on YouTube to help support my work. As I always like to say, I'm in the Front Range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality and ecology, consciousness, the esoteric, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. So if you feel moved by the Rebel Spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts to share the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.